Israel's domestic counterterrorism law of 2016. On the 3rd of November 2021, Israel's commander-in-chief of the Central Command issued a military order declaring the Palestinian organizations as unlawful associations. The 6 designated organizations Al-Haq, law in the service of man, Al-Haq, and Ammar Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association. Sorry, I think, can you hear me? Can you still hear me? Okay, all right. Ammar Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, Defense for Children International Palestine, DCI Palestine, Bisan Center for Research and Development, the Union of Palestinian Women's Committees, and the Union of Agriculture Work Committee. These designations represent an alarming and unprecedented escalation of the occupying powers' attack against Palestinian civil society. These organizations that have been designated carry out indispensable work in the occupied Palestinian territory, including monitoring and documenting human rights violations of international crimes. In accordance with their mandate, Al-Haq and fellow organizations have submitted several core joint communications to the International Criminal Court's Office of the Prosecutor, providing evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity allegedly committed by individuals in the Israeli army and the Israeli authorities. Al-Haq's advocacy work at the international level, especially its continuous and constructive engagement with the ICC, is one of the main reasons driving Israel's long orchestrated smear campaign against its work and the fellow organizations. Israel's unlawful designations come as part and parcel of Israel's decade-long systematic harassment campaign against the Palestinian civil society, and which amounts to an inhumane act of illegal apartheid regime. Notably, the Apartheid Convention lists persecution of organizations and persons by depriving them of fundamental rights and freedoms because they oppose apartheid as one of the acts of apartheid. Also, it's important to note that former ICC prosecutor Bensouda herself acknowledged in 2016 in her report on permanent examinations that certain members of organizations such as Al-Haq and Al-Mizan have been subjected to threats and harassment campaigns. Against this backdrop, in this side event, we will discuss Israel's designations as an alarming escalation of attacks against Palestinian civil society. In particular, we will first hear from His Excellency Mr. Ammar Hijazi, Ambassador Assistant Minister for Multilateral Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of Palestine. Mr. Ammar Hijazi, first, it is important to note that for our listener that the State of Palestine condemned these designations in the strongest terms and pledged unwavering support to the Palestinian organizations, especially since these organizations are registered under the Palestinian NGOs law. I would like to ask you to comment on that, and perhaps first hearing your opening remarks, and second, what is the State of Palestine's assessment and level of satisfaction of the international response to Israel's designations, including the reactions of the UN, its relevant bodies, and third-party states? Also, the position of the ICC, or rather, so far, the silence of the ICC regarding this matter. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ahmed. And allow me at the outset to thank all those attending today this important event, and to thank Al-Haq for co-hosting it. And thanks to technology, we are still able to convene this side event virtually after new restrictions on in-person meetings were imposed due to the rising cases of COVID and the emergence of a new variant. So Let me also extend my gratitude to you, Ahmed, and to fellow distinguished panelists, Dr. Susan Power, Professor John Dugard, and Omar Shakir. I look forward to our discussion, which comes at the end of a particularly challenging year for international justice and the court. Without a doubt, Israel's unlawful criminalization of human rights work and organization, which is a crime by itself, heralds a new era of impunity that undermines both the work of the court and international justice at large. It is a new apex in a willful and cruel campaign stemming from the racist notion that Palestinian lives do not matter, that our rights can be trampled on at will, that Israel must remain unaccountable, and most disturbing perhaps in the context of the court, that our victims have no right to seek redress. Naturally, the state of Palestine has been unequivocal in condemning this hostile act and its determination to support and defend these 6 distinguished Palestinian civil society organizations and their staff, amongst other international organizations and Palestinian organizations that were targeted before. This is in line with our principled position and our obligations as a state party to the Rome Statute. But most importantly, this position is congruent with our obligation towards our people and their fundamental rights, including the right to dissent and advance human rights and accountability for crimes. Quite frankly, one can only stand in awe and admiration at the courage and steadfastness shown by these Palestinian NGOs and their staff in the face of a decade-old, relentless, cruel, and menacing Israeli campaign of incitement, intimidation, and now criminalization. We are proud of our NGOs that have gone from strength to strength and have played an indispensable role in building the current international justice apparatus and the human rights movement. They have become leading experts in the region and have developed unique methods of meticulous research and reporting on crimes while pushing forward Palestine's rightful place in the global human rights movement. These targeted Palestinian NGOs and others serve the most vulnerable groups in Palestine, providing necessary human and legal aid to ensure the survival of Palestinian victims of international crimes, as well as preservation of their aspiration for justice and freedom. Such noble work and tireless advocacy for justice and liberty challenge and agitate the Israeli colonizer that wants to continue committing crimes with impunity and endeavors to ensure the silencing and erasure of its Palestinian victims by all means necessary. And since the opening of the ICC investigations into the situation in Palestine, Palestinian NGOs have worked tirelessly to ensure that victims are aware of their rights and are properly represented. From Gaza to Jerusalem to Bedouin communities under an imminent threat of mass displacement, these NGOs have been documenting Israeli crimes on the ground and preparing the dossiers of evidence ready to be presented to the court. They work directly with victims, advocating for them at both the domestic level and before the court. The criminal intent of this criminalization is to disturb the social fabric of Palestinian society and to disenfranchise the Palestinian people who already live under Israel's illegal occupation and apartheid regime, creating a coercive environment that discourages them from seeking redress and justice for the crimes committed against them. More dangerously, though, it also imposes a serious and credible fear of criminalization or retribution on victims who seek redress through these organizations. With such fear of reprisal, Israel's act of aggression further entrenches system systematic persecution of Palestinian people and widens the impunity gap. As such, by criminalizing Palestinian NGOs, Israel has created a new form and shape of impunity, which undermines the impartiality and effectiveness of the court's ongoing investigation in the situation in the state of Palestine. With the justice mechanism in Palestine under such threat, the ability of Palestinian victims to exercise their right before the court will be impaired. If they are under continued threats, intimidation, and harassment, victims will not carry out their fundamental right to stand before the court and expose the crimes committed against them. Last but not least, the prosecutor cannot fulfill his mandate and execute an impartial and independent investigation if victims are not allowed to participate. As we all know, victims' participation within the court is an essential element of educating crimes. So let there be no mistake. Through this malicious witch hunt, Israel is making good on its promise to fight the court's investigation with all its might. And this assault must not stand. Even before this act, the state of Palestine had repeatedly communicated its concerns in this connection to the international community as a whole, several times to the United Nations, to the court, to the prosecutor, to the state parties, asking them to extend their protection of NGOs and to exert pressure on Israel to respect and protect these organizations as per their obligation under international law, not as an act of charity. I reiterate this urgent call today. The prosecutor must, without any further delay, expedite his investigation into the situation in Palestine and elevate the work of Palestinian human rights defenders. And as per victims' rights in Rome Statute, the court must ensure they are informed about their rights, informed about the court's proceedings, and enable access to participation. We expect the court to ensure Palestinian victims are protected, and a continuous system of interaction with Palestinian victims is maintained through a comprehensive outreach program. Allow me to conclude with these thoughts. The facts yet again confirm that these acts of violence and incitement against justice are not isolated. They point out to clear and deliberate pattern of state-sponsored conduct of structural violence and impunity, as well as hostility against the court, which is born out of decades of exceptional treatment and protection from any form of accountability. And this maybe answers your second question, Ahmed. This accountability is afforded to Israel by the international community and has been enjoying it forever, because countries do have means to end this accountability. Israel is trying to criminalize and eradicate the very possibility of justice. The only acceptable response is to charge forward, to insist on accountability, and to deliver this long denied justice. In relation to the response by the international community, in our opinion, it does not rise to the occasion, particularly as it relates to the Secretary General of the United Nations. Several bodies within the UN have spoken out, including the High Commissioner, and we thank her for that, including special rapporteurs, and we thank them for that. But we think it should have gone to the highest level at the United Nations, including the Secretary General. We did not hear one word of condemnation for such practice. Also, in relation to states were entertaining these kind of accusations against the NGOs. They were asking for evidence where they knew beforehand that there was a witch hunt going on for over a decade against specifically these organizations. And as such, it's unfortunate that this kind of response from states, where we see them rushing and taking measures against countries when it comes to persecution of human rights activists or even political dissidents. Sanctions are applied on states, including in recent occasions. These were not applied to Palestine. And we continue to see that Israel is being treated differently in this and many other instances, and that states are not upholding their responsibilities in this and many other instances. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Ammar, for this presentation. I will now move to our second panelist, our second speaker, Dr. Susan Power, Head of Legal Research and Advocacy at Al-Haq. Susan, Israel's unlawful designations come as part and parcel of Israel's long decade systematic harassment campaign. These acts, for example, when at trial stage at the ICC, amount to offenses against the administration of justice, as stipulated under Article 70 of the Rome Statute. The ICC has not made any statement yet, neither the prosecutor nor the Assembly of State Party or even the presidency of the court. What is your position on this? Why do you think the ICC is still yet to make any statements, although the former prosecutor acknowledged back in 2016 that members of your organizations have already faced such harassment and threats? Also, my second question for you is, what are the possible consequences of these designations on Al-Haq's work and cooperation with the ICC, and how crucial would that be for the current investigation in the situation in Palestine?
Thank you, Ahmed. Well, as Al-Haq, we have a long history of cooperation with the International Criminal Court. Since 2009, Al-Haq has worked in a coalition along with our partners Al-Mizan, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, and Al-Jamir. And our work really started in the aftermath of Israel's 2008 military offensive and carpet bombing of the besieged Gaza Strip, which saw the killing of 1,400 Palestinians over a 22-day period. And at that time, we submitted a communication in support of the government of Palestine's Article 12.3 declaration to the court and to the then prosecutor Ocampo during the first preliminary examination. And then after the State of Palestine's formal accession to the Rome Statute in 2015, Al-Haq, in coalition with our partners, submitted 6 substantive communications to the court, in addition to smaller incident-specific communications and letters as well. So all this time, we were providing a reasonable basis to believe that war crimes and crimes against humanity had been orchestrated in the occupied Palestinian territory. And during the pre-trial chamber stage, our organizations also submitted amicus curiae submissions to the pre-trial chamber on territorial sovereignty of the court over the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. And we are now currently continuing to submit materials to the court during the course of this investigation. I think it's also important to note out that Adjamir, which is one of the other organizations which has been targeted, also has had a really important role with the court. So the general director of Adjamir, Sahar Francis, she's one of the victims' representatives lawyers for the court, and she's already represented victims in written submissions to the pre-trial chamber. So in terms of the designations, on the 19th of October, as you'd already mentioned, Israel designated Al-Haq, along with the 5 other human rights organizations located in the West Bank, as terror organizations under its domestic law from 2016. So these other organizations include Adjamir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, the Bizan Center for Research and Development, Defense for Children International Palestine, the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, and the Union of Palestinian Women's Committees. So these are the leading Palestinian NGOs, and together we have a combined experience of 210 years working on human rights in Palestine. More specifically in relation to Al-Haq, the designation order 373 really targeted our human rights work. So it stated that declared Al-Haq activity is in the field of human rights protection. However, in practice, it is engaged on behalf of the Popular Front in the promotion of steps against Israel in the international arena. So basically, Al-Haq was designated very openly for our legitimate international human rights and advocacy work. And then on the 3rd of November, the Israeli military commander in the West Bank issued a military order giving effect to the designation in the occupied territory and classifying our NGOs as unlawful associations under the emergency regulations. And again, it must be noted here that the emergency regulations had actually previously been repealed by Britain under the Palestine Revocations Order in Council of 1948. So therefore, the application of these emergency regulations to the occupied territory is actually invalid. And what we see here is Israel resurrecting this redundant legislation to carry out all sorts of criminal acts, such as punitive house demolitions, and now we're seeing these designations. So our organizations learned about the declarations through the media. We learned 3 days after they were actually issued. We weren't offered any hearing prior to the decisions. And it later transpired that the document of the 74-page document of evidence, this dossier, had actually been presented by Israel as far back as May to various EU member states. And Israel had been calling on these EU states to defund our organizations. This 74-page dossier has been completely discredited as being completely unsubstantiated and does not offer any evidence of any sort. So it's a completely shambolic and discredited dossier of evidence. It's also notable that, and to be noted that there are confessions contained in this 74-page dossier which have been obtained under torture practices, which is particularly problematic. Also, the counterterrorism law in itself and the use of the counterterrorism in this law is a sweeping attack on the right to freedom of expression. In this way, it does not meet the thresholds of legality, legitimate aim, and our proportionality. It basically confers unfettered powers on the minister to target any NGO and any organization on the basis of secret evidence. And what we're seeing here is that Israel is trying to link Al-Haq to a pretty much forgotten and irrelevant Palestinian group called the PFLP. And it has premised these designations on Al-Haq's legitimate international human rights work. Al-Haq is working for the collective realization of the Palestinian people to self-determination. So the net effect of this, like our offices can now be raided, our staff can be arrested and put on trial in military courts, and our funds and properties and salaries can be seized. And this is all because of our accountability work. For both Al-Haq and also Ammar, we believe that it's our work on the International Criminal Court which is the real target behind this designation. Israel is trying to outlaw our work, delegitimize our organizations, and cut off our funding to absolutely cripple our institutions. And at the same time, Israel is then denying international access to the occupied Palestinian territory. So it denies access to UN special rapporteurs, denies access to investigators from the commissions of inquiry, denies access to potentially investigators at the International Criminal Court as well. And that's why our role here in the occupied territory is so important, because we are a coordinating role between various special rapporteurs. We monitor and document the violations on the ground. We also coordinate between with the victims' representatives and the victims. So our role is absolutely crucial. So the consequences of outlawing our organizations and preventing our work, it's very serious, and it should be treated as an unwarranted encroachment on international criminal justice and a direct attempt to circumvent the transfer of evidence to the International Criminal Court. And just in relation to your second or your first question, I answered the first second and the second first, but in relation to the issue around the silence of the International Criminal Court in relation to these designations, for us, this is particularly problematic. Like in the past, there's this past practice of Israel targeting our staff and our organization with a smear campaign of delegitimization. And this has also included very serious death threats against the general director of our organization, Shawan Jabareen, and our legal researcher, Nadika Swanson, for our work on the International Criminal Court. And previously, Prosecutor Bensouda in her 2016 report on preliminary examinations, had noted that staff members of certain organizations that had gathered information of relevance to the Office of the Prosecutor preliminary examination, such as Al-Haq and Al-Mizan, had been subject to threats and other apparent acts of intimidation and interference, and that the prosecutor had taken these very seriously, and including at the level of the Dutch authorities as the host state to the court. So what we would really like to see is a similar denouncement of Israel's outlawing of our organizations by the prosecutor, and for these designations to be addressed in a very serious manner. And it also must be noted that Israel had previously established a special ministry, which the whole role of this ministry was to target our organizations, and the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs. And it produced a number of reports. And in those reports, it said that Al-Haq had been employing terror tactics, and it highlighted and identified these terror tactics as Al-Haq's leadership in its work and leadership of Palestinian civil society at the International Criminal Court. So this is all directly related, and this terror designation is directly related to our work at the International Criminal Court. And just to highlight some of the huge turning points from this year, so this year, 2021, has been a historic and pivotal year in the situation of Palestine. So in February, we had the pre-trial chamber handing down a decision on territorial jurisdiction, and then we had this greenlighting the way for the prosecutor to open formally the investigation. Then in April, the Biden administration rescinded Executive Order 13928, and this effectively removed any potential targeting of Palestinian NGOs who might have been materially assisting the court against allies of the United States, such as Israel. And then following the election of prosecutor Karim Khan, it became clear by October that this investigation into the situation in Palestine had not been impeded by the change in prosecutor. And I think it's quite telling that Israel's Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi tweeted out that the decision by the ICC prosecutor to open an investigation is a political decision that turns the court into a tool in the hands of extremists who back terrorist organizations and anti-Semitic bodies. But for Al-Haq, we understand this campaign of smears is part of Israel's systematic policy of silencing opposition so that it can maintain its apartheid regime over the Palestinian people. One of the elements of the under the Apartheid Convention under Article 2F of the crime of apartheid is the persecution of organizations and persons by depriving them of their fundamental rights and freedoms because they oppose apartheid. For us, these designations constitute a criminal act of apartheid. We would like to see the prosecutor investigate Israel's acts of apartheid and also include an investigation of Defense Minister Gantz and his role in the designations as an inhumane act of apartheid. Israel's prolonged occupation and criminal acts in the Palestinian territory have been characterized by impunity, by the deliberate non-incorporation of the Geneva Conventions to circumvent the domestic application of humanitarian law, the shielding of international criminals by Israel's military advocate general, who remarkably wears two hats, both as the advisor and the investigator of the army, and also the adoption of Amendment number 8 of the Israel Civil Wrongs Act law of 1952, which prevents Palestinian victims from bringing civil claims before the Israeli courts. The situation in Palestine is the biggest case of our time. It is the case where we must open our own souls and examine our own morality. Why has the international community allowed Israel to implement criminal policies and plans under successive governments for decades? As a Palestinian intellectual, Edward Said, has said, we are the victims of the victims. And now the Palestinian human rights organizations are the victims. We urge the prosecutor to ensure the prioritization of the situation in Palestine and to investigate the targeting of Palestinian human rights organizations as inhumane acts of persecution and apartheid, and to ensure the investigation is fully resourced to proceed to prosecutions without any further undue delay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, for this informative presentation. It is clear, at least for us and those who are working in this field, that these designations are an act of an apartheid regime to conceal its crimes and prevent the international community of seeing the requisite documentations that these organizations provide. And this leads me actually to our third distinguished speaker, Professor Dugard, who is to many, including myself, a role model in the fight against apartheid, whether in South Africa, Namibia, and in Palestine. Professor John Dugard is a professor of international law here in The Hague, in Leiden University, and in South Africa, and a former special rapporteur for the United Nations Human Rights Council for the occupied Palestinian territory. Professor Dugard, few weeks ago, you wrote an article entitled "The Banning of Human Rights Defenders, Israel and South Africa Compared." In this article in particular, you said something that is very important that I would like to quote. You said, "Today, fair-minded and informed people no longer ask the question, does Israel commit the crime of apartheid in occupied Palestine? Instead, they ask the question, is Israeli apartheid worse than that of South Africa?" And you conclude, "Judged by Israel's latest actions against human rights defenders, the answer must be yes, it is worse than apartheid South Africa." End of quote. Professor Dugard, I would like to ask you to comment on these designations and how they have shown that Israel's apartheid is in fact worse than that of South Africa. In addition, I still feel compelled to ask you too about your opinion regarding the ICC position, rather its silence so far, in the light of the importance of these organizations' work and cooperation with the prosecutor's office for his current investigation. Professor Dugard, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I think today there is a general acceptance that apartheid is applied by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. At least public opinion accepts this. This is a result of the excellent studies carried out by Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem. I should mention that when I was Special Rapporteur in 2007, I compared the situation in Palestine to that of South Africa, and I concluded without hesitation that Israel was applying apartheid. So I think there is general acceptance on the part of civil society and the general public that Israel practices apartheid. But of course, states are not willing to confront Israel or the United States, and so they are reluctant to confront Israel on this issue. But I think we should now proceed to the next phase. We accept that Israel does apply apartheid in Palestine, but we must now ask the question, is Israeli apartheid worse than that of South Africa? And of course, it's difficult to make a general comparison, but I think it's important to compare certain actions on the part of Israel with actions on the part of the South African apartheid regime to see which is the worst. And I think the banning of the 6 organizations gives a good example of a case in which South African apartheid was certainly less brutal than that of Israel. Let me just briefly outline what happened in South Africa. At the time that Al-Haq was formed in 1979, public interest firms in South Africa were also established to oppose apartheid, to monitor apartheid, to monitor human rights violations, to advocate change, to advocate a Bill of Rights, and to litigate against the apartheid regime. There were several public interest law firms, one of which I directed, and we were very active during the 1980s. Clearly, the South African regime was very unhappy about this advocacy of human rights and the monitoring of its system. But what is interesting is that the South African regime took no steps against these organizations. Why? The reason is clear. The South African government wanted to maintain an image of legitimacy of the courts. And these organizations were acting within the law and using the South African courts to advance their cause. And the South African apartheid regime did not wish to, as it were, delegitimize itself by suggesting that it no longer respected the rule of law. It wanted to persuade European states and the United States that it did respect the rule of law. And so for this reason, it failed to take any action against organizations like the 6 Palestinian organizations during the apartheid era. Now one asks the question, why does Israel not follow this example? Why does it not wish to preserve the image of respect for the rule of law on the part of Israel? And the only answer I can give is that it knows that European states and the United States are prepared to accept anything that Israel does. They do not expect Israel to practice due process of law and to have a fair legal process. So I think this explains why the states have not protested vigorously against the Israeli action. But I do think the time has come for us to compare South African apartheid with Israeli apartheid more closely. And this is an example of Israeli apartheid as being infinitely worse. The second question you asked me concerns the failure of the prosecutor to condemn the banning of the 6 organizations. I must confess that this comes as a total surprise to me. There has been pressure brought to bear upon the prosecutor to condemn this action because it does interfere with the investigative process. The Palestinian government on the 22nd of November addressed a letter to the prosecutor calling upon him to condemn the banning of these organizations. That's more than 2 weeks ago, and the prosecutor is still silent. And so one asks the question, why? You will recall that the Trump administration took action against the previous prosecutor and imposed sanctions upon her and her staff member. Is there some sort of deal between the prosecutor and the government of the United States that if he is not too active, he will not be subjected to sanctions? We don't know. But obviously there are suspicions as to why the present prosecutor has not taken firm action. After all, Patu Bensouda did on occasion condemn actions taken by Israel which undermine the investigative process. And so I think the time has come for the prosecutor to give an explanation as to why he is silent, or to condemn the banning of these 6 organizations. And of course, this also goes for the Assembly of State Parties as well. It is incumbent upon the Assembly of State Parties during this particular session to condemn the banning of the 6 organizations. Otherwise, the inevitable conclusion will be drawn that the Assembly of State Parties does not have the courage to stand up to Israel and its ally, the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Dugard, for this informative and thought-provoking intervention. I think I will direct some of these questions to our next speaker, Mr. Omar Shakir, Human Rights Watch Israel and Palestine Director. Mr. Omar, in April, Human Rights Watch published a report entitled "A Threshold is Crossed: the Israeli Authorities and the Crime of Apartheid and Persecution." Your report recommended the ICC to investigate the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. Of course, until this very moment, we still do not have the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court saying in record that he, and previously she, will prosecute or will investigate crimes against humanity. Although we know that this it is possible that the prosecutor will do so. As a human rights defender yourself, that was deported from the occupied Palestinian territory by the Israeli authorities because of your human rights work, and in accordance with the legal analysis you provided in your report, to what extent do you believe that these latest designations fit as an act of apartheid attempting to conceal its crimes and preventing the international community from having access to the requisite documentations? Also, in your opinion, what is the reason, the same question, what is the reason behind the ICC's silence so far, especially that such acts has been mentioned and condemned by the previous prosecutor? Why until now we still didn't hear anything from the ICC different organs, whether the prosecutor, the presidency, or the Assembly of State Parties?
Thank you, Ahmed, and let me just, you can hear me okay? Okay, great. Let me just thank you and the organizers. It's such an honor to be with this panel and to address such an important topic at such an important gathering. Let me start, Ahmed, by saying a word about our report, from April. And again, I say humbly in the presence of folks like Professor Dugard and groups like Al-Haq that have been really at the forefront of making the case for many years about why Israeli authorities are committing the crimes of apartheid and persecution. As folks know, Human Rights Watch has been working on Israel-Palestine for well over 3 decades. And over that time, we've documented particular abuses in specific areas. But we had a sense several years ago when reflecting on our body of work that while we were documenting important and key developments in certain areas, we were failing to speak to the underlying reality, on the ground, a reality in which a single government, in effect, rules over an area, the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, where 2 groups of roughly equal size live, and where that government had methodically privileged members of one group, Jewish Israelis, and systematically repressed members of the other, Palestinians, of course, at varying degrees of intensity. So what we did in this report that was a bit different is that we took a different scope of focus. Instead of saying, let's look at freedom of movement in Gaza, or let's look at the right to build in East Jerusalem, we said, let's look at the treatment of Palestinians living under Israeli control. We documented the facts. We spent well over 2 years. We actually also traced themes in decades of Human Rights Watch reporting, and then we applied the law. And of course, apartheid, while coined in relation to South Africa, is now a universal legal term incorporated in leading international treaties. The prohibition against apartheid, has the status of customary international law. It is sort of an established principle. And there's also a crime against humanity of apartheid incorporated both in its own convention as well as under the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court, basically as a crime. It speaks to, and again, there's slight differences in the definition, but basically a situation where you have serious abuses known as inhumane acts that take place in a context of systematic oppression by one group of people over another, and where there's an intent to dominate by the dominant group over the marginalized group. So intent to dominate, inhumane acts, systematic oppression, and then of course there's persecution. A crime against humanity in the Rome Statute, customary international law, basically speaking to severe abuses of fundamental rights, as well as a discriminatory intent. So when Human Rights Watch applied the facts that we documented to the law, we concluded, and it was a very clear determination that Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. This is the most stark assessment Human Rights Watch has ever reached on the conduct of Israeli authorities. It's the first time we find crimes against humanity. Let me say, as the person who wrote our report finding probable crimes against humanity committed by Egypt with regards to demonstrators in 2014 after the military coup, there we said probable, because there was a lot of evidence, but obviously, we found the evidence here so overwhelming that there isn't any similar caveat in terms of our finding. It is commission of these crimes quite clearly. We based that finding, again, I'm not going to do a long presentation of the findings, but basically we found an intent or a policy by Israeli authorities to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians across areas where the Israeli government exercises control, so Israeli occupied territory. That incorporates policies that are meant to, in essence, maximize land, minimize Palestinians, and we go in pages and pages of depth laying that out, as well as finding that the threshold of systematic oppression and inhumane acts was met with particular focus on the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. Of course, when you look at apartheid as a legal term, and to your question, Ahmed, the Apartheid Convention lays out as one of the examples of inhumane acts, the persecution of organizations and parties by depriving them of fundamental rights and freedoms because they oppose, apartheid. That particular piece of the analysis wasn't a focus of our report, but our report, of course, wasn't meant to be, cover every possible, way in which apartheid is met with the situation on the ground, but certainly a very strong case, can be made. And it's not just about this designation, of course. Human Rights Watch did an entire report in 2019, Born Without Civil Rights, that focused on the way in which Israeli military orders in the West Bank deprive Palestinians of their rights, fundamental rights, freedom of association, expression, assembly. And we actually looked at the way in which one of the examples we looked at was freedom of association, and it based on spurious claims of being unlawful organizations or even terrorism, some of the same laws that were invoked as Susan laid out in her presentation. And it's undeniable, and Human Rights Watch shares the assessment of Susan, that this is not this event is not, of course, coming out of nowhere. It's part of a systematic effort to muzzle human rights reporting and punish those who criticize Israel's human rights record. That policy has affected internationals. Again, Susan listed some of those affected. It's affected Israelis, but Palestinians have always borne the brunt of that repression. And this designation, again, comes after a history in which Palestinian human rights defenders, including members of these organizations, have faced punitive travel bans, have faced arrests and criminal charges, have faced raids on their offices, right? So this is merely an escalation, not merely, but in the sense it's an escalation of a prolonged campaign to attack, these organizations. But we should be crystal clear. The consequences here are incredibly stark. I think it's an existential threat to Palestinian civil society. The military designation following the initial designation gives the Israeli government the power to entirely, as my colleague and friend Michael Sfard noted yesterday at a UN event, to effectively do the equivalent of assassination, by law for these organizations, to completely liquidate, their existence. So I think the consequences there are quite stark. Of course, Al-Haq, Ammar, some of the other groups, much of their primary advocacy focus has been on the ICC. So it's clear that this declaration could well affect their ability to engage the court. Which brings me to your second question, Ahmed, regarding, the International Criminal Court. Clearly, this prosecutor has taken a different approach with regards to how the office uses public statements in a way that's different than the prior prosecutor that used public statements as a way to signal, to message, to reinforce the mandate of the court. Human Rights Watch believes it's incredibly important that the International Criminal Court speaks out. I should note there are many outlets. It's not just the prosecutor's office. The president's office has an external relations role. The associations of state parties has an external relations role. So it's not just about the prosecutor. There are other parts of the ICC that could speak. I would also note that I think it's instructive to look at the example of US sanctions on the ICC and the way in which the international community very strategically mobilized around that, where we saw all sorts of targeted interventions. I think we need a strategic approach here that's similar, because look, when we talk about groups like Al-Haq, we're not just talking about the most prominent groups of Palestinian civil society, we're really talking about trailblazers in the global South in terms of human rights groups that engage in some of the most important work. I remember several years ago being in Ramallah celebrating Al-Haq's 40th anniversary, and many of us spoke about the way in which their work has been in many ways a guiding light for human rights groups around the world. So I think the implications are quite significant, and I think we need a similar strategic approach for the international community. And even in the independent experts review, there was a recommendation there that talked about how to deal with attacks on the court. And frankly, I think when you're talking about attacks on groups that have built so much of their profile around engagement with the ICC, much of that analysis very much applies. Let me just conclude, by going back to the designations here, right? And just sort of highlighting why for Human Rights Watch, this is an attack on the international human rights movement. We issued a statement with Amnesty, I think hours after hearing about the news, where we set that out. And I really believe how the international community responds will be a true test of its resolve to protect human rights defenders. When you work on Israel-Palestine, diplomats will tell you, listen, we can't do much about the situation on the ground, but we're always there for human rights defenders. I think this is a chance to prove that this is true. Too often, international principles and institutions, when facing the crucible, when facing tests around controversial, challenging issues like Palestine, have failed the test. This is a test to the international community's resolve. And I think it's critical that all those concerned about human rights and international law, meet the challenge. And I think the International Criminal Court should be a part, of that effort. I'll stop there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Omar. I think we have very interesting questions. I will be coming back to you with the questions, and a question from me personally regarding your latest lecture here in Amsterdam. But here we have a question from Professor Jeff Handmaker, and I think I will direct this question to His Excellency Ambassador Ammar Hijazi. The question is regarding the statement of the Ambassador of South Africa in the current Assembly of State Parties, which welcomed the pre-trial chamber decision on the territorial jurisdiction in the situation in Palestine, and reaffirmed and emphasized the importance and the role that civil society plays in support of the court's work. In the light, Professor Handmaker says, in the light of this principled statement, what is your message to other state delegations who are seemingly unclear how to respond to these bogus designations? Mr. Ammar.
Thank you. Our message was clear from the beginning, from the moment that this whole thing started. And it was that international community should hold Israel accountable for these actions. Israel should not be allowed to trample international law and continue to enjoy that. And that no one should entertain such accusations, because they are baseless, and everybody knows that Israel has been in a witch hunt for so long against these states. We further asked international community to continue funding these organizations, to abide by their duties in relation to the international human rights movement, and to denounce Israel's measures not to aid and not to assist any of its practices, including in relation to NGOs. We also called for ensuring accountability and for Israel crimes, which is the best answer to this kind of behavior. Our belief is Israel always on the attack to derail any effort internationally that are aimed at holding it accountable. And as such, we should not entertain these actions, but rather exact price on them and hold it accountable. There is much needed, and I think the international behavior beyond the court, but within the realm of international law and UN in relation to the question of Palestine, has always been accommodative of Israeli behavior. including the terminology used in relation to the conflict, in relation to the question of Palestine. Many states avoid the use of the word occupation in their statements and the presence to qualify Israel's presence in the occupied territory, let alone allowing for investigating further what this occupation has resulted in, as has been explained by the panelists today, including in relation to apartheid and colonialism. It is because of this lack of action, and it is because of this kind of response and weak response at best from the international community, in particular those who cry out loud when it comes to violations of human rights elsewhere around the world, is that Israel continuing to do what it is doing. I believe that the best response is to push forward with the investigation, to allow for actions and accountability to be exacted on Israeli behavior. Other than that, I think it will be lacking, and it will leave many things to be wanted in relation to response.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. We have another question from Jeff, and this time is to Professor Dugard. Professor Dugard, Jeff says, would you agree that the ICC should be interpreting its understanding of the crime of apartheid under Article 7 of the Roma Statute in light of Article 2, Paragraph F of the Apartheid Convention, which indicates the persecution of organizations and persons opposing apartheid as an act of apartheid? Professor Dugard. Yes.
Yes, this is a difficult question because it raises the whole relationship between the Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute. But I do think that it is possible for the prosecutor to bring this action on the part of the Israeli government under the rubric of the crime of apartheid, the crime against humanity under the Rome Statute. Because after all, this is an example of Israel practicing domination of one racial group over another by banning the 6 organizations. Israel is taking action in favor of one racial group against another racial group in order to dominate that group. And this clearly constitutes the crime of apartheid. And I think it's high time that the prosecutor made it clear that his office is interested in prosecuting not only war crimes, but also crimes against humanity.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Professor Dugard. I think the official position of Al-Haq is in line with what you said. The prosecutor has to make a clear statement that he is considering the investigation of crimes against humanity, especially those of apartheid and persecution. I have another question to Omar, and maybe we conclude with this, unless there are other remarks. Omar, a few weeks ago, you were here in the Netherlands and you gave a lecture in Amsterdam. I personally attended, and it was a pleasure meeting you. And you said something that is very important in my personal view. You said that Human Rights Watch said that this is apartheid, but the Palestinian organizations, especially Al-Haq, has been saying this for tens of years, and now Human Rights Watch agree. Now, my question is, now that Palestinian, regional, and international human rights organizations are on the same page, that the Israeli occupation as such is in fact a tool to maintain its apartheid regime, can we expect, in light of the reluctance of of state positions or official statements or official steps in this regard? Can we expect more brave collective efforts from civil society in different levels in the fight against this 21st century apartheid?
Thanks, Ahmed. It was a pleasure seeing you there indeed. I think there is growing consensus around Israeli apartheid. And I think we have, as I noted there, and I said earlier in my remarks, we really have Palestinian scholars, human rights organizations, and others, as well as brave people like Professor Dugard, who have been, despite the consequences, saying this for years, if not, I think, in many of these groups for well over a decade. But I think we have seen an important shift take place in recent months, or years, where there is growing consensus, around this. I think you have a reality now where I think you have 7 or 8 Israeli human rights, organizations. You have Palestinian human rights organizations. You have major international human rights groups, groups in Europe and elsewhere beyond even the human rights community. You have legal scholars, that have talked about apartheid in relation to human and Palestinians. There's a forum in Egypt talk. You've had Lawrence Tribe in the US, Philippe Sands in the UK. You've had respected commentators. You've had Congress people in the United States, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You've had European parliamentarians, parliaments across Europe. Even within Israel, you've now had, the former Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General of Israel, former Israeli ambassadors to South Africa, members of the current Israeli Knesset. There was even a forum hosted at the Israeli Knesset, 54 years from occupation, to apartheid. You have the former Secretary General of the United Nations, and you even have states, and that's important. You have apartheid being used by the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Conference, South Africa and Namibia, who have hosted a UN General Assembly side event in June around apartheid. You have even the foreign ministers of France who talked about apartheid, Luxembourg, who made reference to the Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem reports in particular. So I think we've seen significant movement. And I think that's critical because the first step to solving any problem is to diagnose it correctly. I think the wrong diagnosis leads to the wrong conclusion. Apartheid is the reality, for millions of Palestinians. And I think we're seeing more and more people come to terms, with that reality. And I think it's notable to say that even those that have yet to come there, we briefed governments across Europe, the United States, people aren't disagreeing with the facts or on the merits. So you haven't seen really a substantive critique of, well, the facts don't meet the law in this or that way. So I think that's also significant. It's not gone unnoticed. So I think we're going to continue to see that shift in the recognition grow in the coming months and years as other reports come out, as more discussion takes place. Now, we need that to translate into changes on the ground. That is yet to take place, unfortunately. We still see, quite stark developments, whatever way you want to look at the situation, whether it be these designations, whether it be the increasingly dire situation in Gaza, just the latest, of course, round of hostilities in May, the ongoing closure. None of this has changed with the new Israeli government. In some ways, it's gotten worse. Home demolitions, settlement expansions. I do think it's notable that the international community has, I don't think there's been a sense that this new government will change the course on these issues. I do think there's recognition of that fact, but we need the international community to take the sorts of human rights measures that a situation of this gravity warrants. And that's where our challenge is going to be, I think, in the days ahead. How can you translate these growing number of voices that, say, recognize apartheid into actors that will call for and eventually take action that is commiserate with a situation of this gravity? I think there's going to be some movement. That's not going to be an easy battle. This designation is a reminder of the lengths at which the Israeli government and its supporters will go to muzzle efforts to counteract their policies. So I think the challenge is enormous. So I think we can take some I think we can take some pause to note the progress that's been made with this analysis while being clear-eyed that it is yet to translate to changes on the ground. It's an enormous challenge. And frankly, it's a reminder of why we need these 6 groups in the fight, because if, and so much of our resource and energy, rightfully is now going to defending their ability to do their work. But we precisely need them to do their work so that we can actually make traction on ending these grave abuses.
Thank you very much, Omar. Maybe I will get back to you if there are more questions from our listeners. But a question for Susan in the same vein, actually. Susan, as Al-Haq is one of the earliest human rights organizations and civil society organizations, not only in Palestine or in the Arab world, even in the world. Al-Haq has been saying that this is a situation of apartheid for tens of years. Is there a sense that the world starts recognizing apartheid after, for example, Israeli organizations said it, after human rights said it, not when the Palestinians said it? What is the reason to that? I'm being very blunt here. We of course, I know, and it's publicly made that Al-Haq supports all of these efforts from partners. But in your opinion, why is it that the world needs to hear it from international organizations or Israeli organizations, not from Palestinian organizations?
Well, thanks for this question. Yeah, I have one word for this, and that's racism. The international community is racist, against Palestinians, and treats Palestinians as a victim subgroup who is completely dispossessed and placed under the control of Israel, and is a voiceless population, and needs third parties to amplify their voice and to endorse their voice. And this is why we have even still, people, other organizations speaking out for our 6 organizations. Our 6 organizations are well able to speak out for themselves. The Palestinian population is a highly educated population. It's well able to speak out for themselves. And what we need is not other people to speak for us, and other people to speak for Palestinian human rights organizations. What we need is for people to listen to what Palestinians are saying on the ground, and what are the calls from Palestinians on the ground? What are the root causes? Palestinians have been saying for decades, this is apartheid. For decades, like it was 2009 when Al-Haq had the seminal report that this was apartheid. So we've been saying this and this was the end product of even decades before that. That this was nearly at the very start. We could see immediately that this was apartheid on the ground. So this is part and parcel of the problem. And like even what we're seeing at the moment is such a huge level of disrespect for our organizations. Our organizations are the longest running organizations. We're the most respected organizations on the ground. We're the backbone of Palestinian civil society. When you're erasing these Palestinian human rights organizations, this is the dismantling of the entirety of Palestinian civil society. This is an absolute erasure and direct attack on the fabric of Palestinian society. And for third states to listen to Israel and to defer to Israel and give Israel time to go and try and get more evidence against our organizations, when the international community knows that Israel is committing war crimes against humanity, and that it's engaging in a decades-long colonization process of expansionism, of land appropriation, of pillage of natural resources, and forcible transfer and erasure of the Palestinian people. And then to defer back to Israel, to give Israel more time to fabricate more nonsense, to try and criminalize our organizations. It's such a lack of respect for the Palestinian people. And it really encapsulates where we are right now, that our voice means nothing. And we have to cry and beg for the international community to progress to progress the prosecution of Israeli criminals at the International Criminal Court, that we have to go to all these measures when any other situation would be progressed and advanced with the respect that it deserves. And this all comes back to the type of racism that we see internationally. And it's an indictment on the international community. And it's time that the international community stands strong and walks with Palestinians into the International Criminal Court, and walks with Palestinians and watches Israeli perpetrators of mass atrocity crimes being prosecuted.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for being blunt, and I second that. And if I can add to that from personal experience, while I do believe in the international community, regardless of its behavior, and I do believe in international law, it saddens me personally to feel that the international community wants to hear about the Palestinians, but does not want to hear from them. It's like, it's okay if others talk about the Palestinians, but it seems that it will be shocking if we speak for ourselves, because the international community apparently does not want to hear the Palestinian perspective. It is very unfortunate to agree with that and to conclude that. We have maybe one last question we can address to any of the speakers who would like to address this question, and then maybe we will give concluding remarks to each speaker in 2 minutes. The question is from Lavina. She says, what do you think is the perception of the ICC's activities among the Palestinian general public? Do they deem it useful at all? Do they hope something from it? I don't know who would like to take on this question, but anyway, I will suggest giving each of the speakers 2 minutes for concluding remarks, and I will start with Ambassador Hijazi, whether he would like to address this question or just give the concluding remarks. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I think, well, in general, the Palestinian public is becoming less and less enchanted with international law and international mechanisms, because honestly, it has not come to their aid. And in spite of this question has been born, in spite that this question has been born at the international level, and we had nothing to do with it. Our land was partitioned by the UN and by the international community. And this is why they continue to have a permanent responsibility towards the question of Palestine. I think the panelists and as has been said very rightly by Susan, our voice was always discarded as Palestinian people. But this is not to say that the Palestinian people are giving up on their struggle and on their right. To the contrary, the Palestinian people are more resilient than ever. They are determined to march forward until their rights are fully achieved and respected. And we are not less human than any human being. Just like all nations stood up to their aggressors, just like they confronted their colonizers, we are going to do the same and continue to persevere and continue with our steadfastness until we achieve our goals. This is something that has not even, everything that Israel did have not shaken a bit of that determination. I wish to end very clearly that what we need to do, and the message is for everyone out there, that we must stop the cynical political exploitation of important issues that relate to humanity, and turning it into political or economical or social whip when it is convenient for some, yet rejecting it and rejecting these universal standards when it is politically inconvenient. And this has been the story of Palestine. We have been a politically inconvenience for the international community, but it is the determination of the Palestinian people. It is the struggle and everything that we have been doing in the past 100 years that kept us standing and pushing forward. Of course, we take note of all peace-loving nations that stood by our side. We take note of all principled people, including the people you see in the panel today, and many others, including international organizations that have been supportive to our cause, not on the basis that they like Palestinians more than Israelis, but on the basis of humanity, in the basis of justice, and on the basis of international law and what the international community and civilized nations have charted for themselves to move forward. This is our belief. This is what basically keep us moving forward, although the price is very high, and every mother that buries her child, we cannot do anything to bring him back to her, but and our youth are spending their lives in Israeli jails, but this will not sway our determination, and we will continue pushing. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for the distinguished panelists, Susan, John, and Omar. Thanks, Ahmed, for handling this discussion, and thanks for everyone who attended, and for our mission in the Netherlands for also organizing this, especially Ambassador Rawan of Yusuf. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Ammar, and indeed, special thanks to our mission in the Netherlands, where I am right now. We're having this virtual side event from the embassy, and I am particularly privileged by being in the same room with Professor Dugard. I will give the floor now to Susan for answering the question: should the Palestinian people still believe in the International Criminal Court, and your concluding remarks?
Yes, absolutely. This is, I mean, to believe in the International Criminal Court and to support the International Criminal Court and to work actively with the International Criminal Court, and also to not be afraid, you know, and for the victims to come forward and to cooperate with the victims' representatives, lawyers, and to share their stories with the court. This is an important part of the of the process of healing, and the belief in the belief in rule of law and the belief in the international mechanisms is the pathway towards peace, and it's absolutely vital and critical that we continue to engage in these processes, even though we're targeted and even though our organizations are targeted and defunded and outlawed and delegitimized. We can't roll back on where we've come from, where our path is the path towards peace, and it's absolutely imperative that we continue along these lines, and that's why we really appreciate the support of the international community, but we also call on third states to be really strong and to target and to challenge Israel's Minister of Defense to rescind these designations, so that we can continue to do our work and we can continue to be the backbone of Palestinian civil society as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you for your time. Professor Dugard, same question. Do you think the Palestinian people could still believe in the and expect much from the International Criminal Court? And your concluding remarks. The floor is yours.
Let me just say that it's very difficult for a person like myself, who's devoted his entire life to international law, to believe in international law today in the light of the way in which the international community, knowing full well that Israel has violated fundamental principles of international law, but refuses to take action. It's interesting to compare the response of the international community to apartheid in South Africa with its response to apartheid in Israel. I always believed that ultimately international law would prevail in respect of apartheid in South Africa, and it did. But when it comes to Israel, the international community fails to apply international law, and I suspect it is for two reasons: because Israel manages to portray anyone who opposes Israel as an anti-Semite or as a terrorist, as we've seen in the case of the 6 organizations. I think the international community must have the intelligence and the courage to examine these 2 accusations raised by Israel, both of which are false, and then to conclude that the time has come to take action against Israel for its violations of international law.
Thank you very much, Professor Dugard, and thank you for joining us today here at the embassy in The Hague. Now I'll give the floor to Omar Shakir with the same question and your concluding remarks.
Thanks, Ahmed, and I've learned a lot from this conversation. I think one way to sort of tie everything together is to say the Israeli government felt emboldened to act in the way they did against the 6 organizations because of decades of impunity for grave abuses. The reality here is they are banking on the same international community response that they've seen in similar instances. I mean, for example, my own deportation by the Israeli government from Israel in the occupied territory. I remember warning diplomats, specifically, if, this deportation takes place and then proceeds without consequence, we will be speaking about the outlawing of local civil society groups in the span of months, if not years. Here we are 2 years later, right? And we're dealing with that prospect. And let's not be under any presumptions. If this goes through and happens, it will continue against other organizations. It will expand to others. It'll have significant consequence. So, and of course, Susan's absolutely right. If that's the response to Human Rights Watch, you can imagine the international community's response being much worse when it comes to the designation of Palestinian organizations. And again, there are precedents. Look at the case of Mohammed al-Halabi from World Vision, where there were outlandish claims made by the Israeli government, debunked in a series of reports by external actors, but the international community distanced himself. And Halabi continues to sit in an Israeli prison without having been convicted of a crime. The international community is making a bet here that there will be a storm, but the storm will subside, and that eventually this action will freeze, will cut the ties between these groups and Palestinian civil society writ large with the international community, and will eventually succeed in diminishing and hurting their work. If we want a different outcome, we need a different response, from the international community. It's not enough for the international community to say we're waiting to see the evidence. There is no evidence. It's quite clear that, and this has been, repeatedly documented and shown, this is about muzzling their work. And we need to call it for what it is. It's not enough for countries to hear it from Israel that they're not going to act on this. These kind of empty words we've seen take place in many other cases. What's vital is that these efforts are condemned, that there's calls on Israel to rescind the designation, that countries say that these designations are null and void with no legal effect. That's conveyed widely. These countries should impose countermeasures on Israel if steps are not taken. And of course, they need to situate this event in the context of the larger reality of apartheid and Israel's grave human rights abuse. So Ahmed, to your question, really to get to the heart of it, there is reason, and I understand people who are skeptical of international institutions, given what Palestinians have faced for decades on end. And given how often, when it comes to the question of Palestine, the international community has failed to apply the same standards and apply its own principles. So I think it's really a test. It's a test on the ICC. It's a test on Karim Khan. Will you, follow the investigation where it leads? And, will the international community respond to that set of action? I understand the skepticism. At the end of the day, I'm an optimist, and I'm hopeful that, the ICC will stand up to the test. But our eyes will be focused on this. And if we believe that that's not being done, we'll be the first ones with our partners like Al-Haq to criticize that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omar. And at the end of this event, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers for their informative and thought-provoking presentations. I would also like to thank our attendants for their interesting and inquisitive questions. In the end, I would also like to invite you all to follow Al-Haq statements at the 20th Assembly of State Parties today's afternoon. I can assure you, and I can promise on behalf of Al-Haq, that this discussion will be reflected upon in our statement at the ASP. And at the end, allow me to conclude this session with a quote from Benjamin Friends, former Nuremberg prosecutor and advocate for global justice. And I send that in particular to the current prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and to all states who tried to make a position that the ICC should not have jurisdiction in the situation in Palestine, claiming that this is an obstacle for peace. Benjamin Friends was right when he said at Nuremberg, there can be no peace without justice, and no justice without law, and no meaningful law without a court to decide what is just and what is lawful under any given circumstances. Colleagues, friends, thank you very much for your time and for your kind attention, and I wish you a very nice day. Goodbye.